Hello there, this is one of a series of videos accompanying the Joomla tutorial developing an MVC component, and this time we're looking at the step adding configuration. Now in the previous step we added the ability for the messages to have associated categories and for those categories to be then displayed on the front end. With this step we're providing the ability to choose whether those categories are to be displayed or not. And we do that in two ways. The first is in our global configuration. We can decide whether the default is that the category should be shown or should be hidden. And then on an individual message basis, we can decide whether to override that default. So for example, the default here is show. Here we've got it hidden. And then for this goodbye world message, if we click on GW, we find that it's not shown. If we change this then to show and save that, and then click again, we find that the category is displayed. So if you've gone through the tutorial and built the code, you'll be able to have seen that for yourself. So let's just start going through the code. And there's a number of things that I plan to talk about in this step, and we'll just go through these one by one. The first is the configuration parameters. So if we come down here, we see this file here, config.xml. And this contains the field that is going to be displayed on our global configuration here. So it's just a kind of normal sort of field, radio button. It's got the ability to have labels, and if we look at those labels, we can see that those can be defined down in our ini file. And you may be thinking, well, this global configuration is associated with all the different sorts of components. How is it that these are defined in the ini file and not the sys_ini file? Because this is kind of cross component. But you've got to remember that we only get to the hello world bits whenever we click on the hello world. So whenever we click there, you can see from down the bottom down here, it's going to do another get. And it's at that point there where it's showing the hello world options, and that's when it picks up the translated strings. So that's why they're in the ini file and not in the sys_ini file. So we'll go back up. That's the first thing. The second thing is J toolbar helper preferences, and the preferences button, just in case you were a bit unsure, is what this is over here on our right hand side, that options button. And if we click on that, that will take us straight to the global configuration part for hello world. And we can cancel that and we'll be taken back to where we were. So that's that. The next thing is the new params field in the database. So we're adding a new field into our database, and if we have a look on our some PHP myadmin here, you can see that what we've got in the params field, if we put some of these values into our hello world records, is a JSON string, JSON format string. And it's really saying that if we set it to, if we set something like this, hello world to the default, we'll just set that use global. And then we'll refresh this. And you see that the default is where there's nothing, kind of like an empty string there. And then 0 will be where it's hidden. down here, or 1 means that it is shown. And if you have a look through the other components on the system, you'll find a lot more of these parameters. For example, if you look in the contact details, go along, find a lot of stuff there. Or if you go to banners, for example, here it is here. So really what we've got here is the ability to put into a field information that relates to a number of things. So we're kind of like condensing a number of fields into one. And the question arises, certainly in my mind, when is it appropriate to use kind of like a new field in our database record, and when is it appropriate to use the params field and just put the information into that JSON string. In our example here, we're introducing a new feature into the configuration, in the global configuration. We've got this global hide and show, and we're putting our specific hide and show into our params. So you may think that, well, if it's in the global parameters and we're overriding it, does that mean we should put it into our local params field? Well, that's not really the case, because if we take, for example, this is com banners here, and we look at the stuff that is in the params field, and we go to global config, oops, where's it gone? And go to banners. Well, we see that the stuff in the params field of banners, image URL, width, height, alt, isn't the same as the stuff here. In fact, the stuff here, purchase type, track impressions, track clicks, meta keyword prefix. You can see over here, purchase type, track clicks, track impressions, meta key prefix. So the things that are actually in the global parameters are overridden through these fields here. So it seems to be more just a subjective case of whether you want to kind of give the information a certain prominence by putting it into its own field, or whether you just want to bung it with everything else into the params field. Doesn't seem to be any particular guidance on it. I've had a look around the web and can't find anything in particular. However, if you are using a params field, you have to be aware that there are certain things you have to do, and that's what we're going to go on to in the next thing. So if you remember about creating forms, we've got, for normal fields, we've got a field definition in our XML, and that will result in, on the web page, we'll get a label and a control, for example, an input text box there. And that will then, when we hit save, that will result in a post with the JForm array for our XXX field being set to some data, whatever data was put into that input box. Then in our controller, we'll do an input to get that JForm data, and that will then be in an array sort of format. We then bind that to our table and store that in the database. However, now with the params field, it's going to be slightly different. And with the params field, we've got this fields thing here. And if we go to the tutorial code, you'll see that here. Oops, fields. Now this fields and this field set here are both called params, which is somewhere we bit unfortunate, but it's the fields thing that is the important thing here, not the field set. So the fields means that whenever the web page will still get the field as per usual, but whenever we do the post will go up in a different format. So we can see that if we go to our edit form and put on our debug tools, and we'll change something here. We'll change this back to hide and save and close. And we see this post that has gone up to the server. And if we look at the post parameters, and you can see in there, you've got JForm and in brackets params, and in the second brackets it's going to be show category. So it's kind of like a double array there, not a single array. And that's the effect of this fields kind of tag in that XML. It means that the fields which are inside that fields tag are going to have an extra kind of dimension to the array. So they're going to end up being the top outside array is going to have this here, params, and then inside the field is going to have show category. So then in our controller, when we get our data in, our data itself for these parameters isn't going to be an array, but data of params is going to be an array. And it's going to be an array of keys or key to value sort of things. So whenever we want to put that into the database, we'll be wanting to put that into like a JSON string. So in our model, we'll have to convert that array to a JSON string before we put it into the database, which is why in our code, we look at down here, we have got this overriding bind function. So array is what contains the data that has come from the post, and that's going to be a mixture of normal fields plus the params field. And it's saying if there's a params field there, and if it's an array, then what we do is we load it into this thing here and convert it to a string. So we end up converting our array, our params array, into a JSON string, which is then put into the database. And we're going to look at Registry in a couple of minutes. But that's why we've got this bind function, because it will take the params array and convert it into the form that it needs to be in order for it to be written to the database. So that is really covering the case of where we've got a form and someone has put data into the form, we've taken it into our server and we're writing it to the database. Now what about the other case where we've got the params in our database and we want to put it to a form? In the normal case, for normal fields, we're going to do a load on the table, and table XXX is going to have the value of that field. We'll then do get item or get items in our view, and we'll end up with a kind of like a key value arrangement, and then we'll use that whenever we display it on the form in a layout file, for example, or if we pass to load form data in the case where we're providing an edit functionality and we want to show initially on the edit screen what the current values of the record are in the database at the moment. So that's the sort of stuff that we have been doing up to now. Now for our new case of the params field, when we do the load, the params is going to be in a JSON string format. So we will need to convert it somehow to an array if we want to have an array in the same sort of format to either display on the form or to pass to load form data. So the question is, how do we, or where do we convert that params to an array? And this is where it does get a bit tricky, because if we look at our, I'm going to look at this file here, our admin model, here it is here. Now, if you watch some of the videos when we were doing the work to display the editing form, that's, if we go in here, that's this form here, which comes up whenever we click on something here to change a message, the editing form here. If you were looking at that when we actually did our kind of like our own thing, we find that in the view we had to get the ID. Whoops, I'll go to the previous one. We had to get the ID and the item. We had to get the current record, and then we got the form, and then we used the item to pass into load form data the current state of that record. And then we found, when we looked at JModelAdmin, we found that it had a get item. So rather than writing get item ourselves, we could just use the get item in the JModelAdmin, and it would provide the data for this load, for this load form data call. So if we have a look in our code, this is get item within that JModelAdmin. And it's getting the load, so it's loading the record from the database, and it's got these lines here. If property exists, if it's got a params field there, it's doing the opposite. So it's taking that JSON string and converting it to an array. So if we go back down here, when we're in the process of taking our params and putting them out on a form, if we're using this admin get item, we don't need to do the conversion because it's automatically done for us. So whenever we displayed this, we didn't actually do any conversion because it's already done for us in that function. However, it's not done for the site. So we find in our code later on, we have to do conversion from the format that we get from the database here. But this item is load object. That will have the form that it is in the database. And then we'll have to convert it. We put the this item params into this registry and get out it in the registry format. And I'll cover that just in a minute. And also, it's not done on get items. So if you have any database fields or database information that you're putting into the params field, and you're also displaying on our table like this, if you've anything like that, you have to be aware that that conversion isn't done automatically, and you would have to do that yourself. So that's that. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, the next thing is fieldset. So if we look at fieldset, if we go back up here, you see fieldset. Now, what relevance does fieldset have? And you're probably aware that there is an HTML tag called fieldset, but really there is no hard connection between what we have as a fieldset here in Joomla and the HTML fieldset. The Joomla fieldset really is just kind of a collection of fields. The advantage that it does provide you is that it does allow you to work with a set of fields kind of nearly as one. So if we look down at our layout here, we can kind of work with field sets and display field sets as one, rather than having a lot of code associated with individual with individual fields. And if we look at JForm, we have got things like get field sets, which really gives you the field sets which are in the form. So in that case, it would give you the two field sets that we've got here. One here, which is the details, and one here, which is the params. And then in the second, we've got get field set, which is the ability to get each of the fields within a particular field set. So in our layout file here, notice that this first call is to get field sets. But the second call is to get field set. So the first thing is kind of has a loop over the two field sets which are in our form, and the inner loop here, it's getting the fields for that particular field set. And you can do other things. For example, you can do render field set. And render field set will really just give you back the HTML associated with all of the fields within that field set. And you can just echo that, and it just outputs all the fields, the labels and the control fields for each of the fields in your field set. So it's really just a mechanism whereby you can kind of work with a group of fields. As I said, there is this field set HTML tag. There's no hard connection between the field sets and that. You can put that in if you like, or you can totally disregard it. So a field set is just a way of working with a set of fields. Okay, we've come across a couple of times now this thing called registry. What is it? Now, the first thing to notice, if you do look at our code here in our bind, you see new J registry. If you compare that with our code in this is in our admin get items, you see new registry. So there's a subtle but significant difference there. And if you go along to this issue here, you can read a little bit about the background to it. But basically, J registry seems to be kind of like the old version of this. And what has now been developed is this new thing, which is called Joomla registry, which is basically registry in this different namespace. And there is a description of it here, and there is an API for it as well. And the sort of things you can do with it are basically put information into it and get information out in various sorts of formats. And we've actually seen an example of the registry. If we go into our session, we've looked a number of times at this data down here with the state variables. And this is basically held in a registry. Now, a registry is an object. It's not a data structure. So this isn't the exact, what a registry is, but it's a representation of the data in this particular registry, where it's being output as a kind of like a JSON string. So as I say, you can put things into it and take things out in various sorts of formats. And that's really what it's been used for in the various cases that we've looked at. So for example, in our, going back to our admin code, here we're taking, getting a new registry and passing as a constructor item params. And remember, item params here is a JSON string. And some of these things it will give you here, registry load string, and it's giving you that there. And then what we're doing is we're getting it out via registry to array. And if we look at the API there, it just gives a conversion into an array. So that's one example. If we look at our bind code, we see another example here. It's creating this registry object, parameter load array into it. So at the moment here, you're loading an array into it, and then you're getting out a string. I should say, actually, with that admin thing, you've got a registry there. If you just change JRegistry into registry, you do get an error because it's in this separate namespace. And if you look at the top of our admin code, you can see use Joomla registry. So it's actually using that namespace, so it's able to find it. But if you don't put that in, or you don't qualify it properly by giving the full kind of namespace and class, then you'll get an error. So that's a second example. The third example, if we go on further down, we see this call here. JFactory get application, get params, and that also is a registry. So if we go to get params, it will actually get the application parameters, and that will include our configuration parameters, our global configuration parameters, but you can see that the type that it is Joomla registry. Now, incidentally, it's just something you should probably be aware of, is whenever you call JFactory get application, you get two different things depending on whether you're in the admin side of things or in the front end of the site side of things. So if you're in the front end of the site, you're going to get a JApplication site object back, and that's where you get this get params. If, however, you're on the admin side of the site, you'll get a JApplication administrator object back, and you'll notice that there are no get params. There's no get params method there. So you can try, if you like, just calling JFactory get application get params in your admin code and just see the error that results. So that's the third one. And then again, what we're doing here, and we've seen it just a moment ago, but we've got this is the object from the database. This is a record from the database, and this item params is the params record from the database, and it's a JSON string. So we've got a new registry object here, and we're loading this JSON string into it. And then we're defining this item params is now this registry object. We're also then taking the params that we set in as a state variable up here, which is the global config. And then we're merging on top of that global config, we're merging the item params from our record. And if we go back to here, it talks about merging registries. So for example, what you can do, you can merge one registry on top of another, and it works out in the same way as this top thing here, which is really doing a load string on top of another registry, but it's a similar sort of thing. So we've got a load string JSON1, which comes from this, and then we're taking that and we're loading a second one onto it, or merging a second one onto it. And the output here, as you can see, where JSON2 has got something defined, key B is set to a new value. So whatever is written was in the first registry gets overwritten by what you merge on top of it, except in the case where here JSON2 doesn't have any key A value, and so that KA value just stays. So this is really the sort of thing which we want for our parameters, because we have got here is our global parameters in this string. So that's this show category, hide or show. And we're merging on top of that what we've got from our local parameters, what we've got from our database here in this string here. So if our database record has got a field set, it's going to overwrite whatever was in that, and it's going to take as a first preference what is in our database record. However, if our database record doesn't have a value set, for example, if it's got a value set to just an empty string, or it hasn't got anything at all, then what is going to happen is that the global config is going to be taken by preference. So I hope that's clear. As I say, you can read up more about these sorts of things in the registry API there. Okay, so that's Joomla registry, get state and populate state. So we have in our code here, populate state, set state, and down here, get state. So if we have a look in our model legacy, and we do a search for get state and have a look at the code there. This is the function that get state is calling within the model. And if we look at the code here, so it's saying if not the state set, then the first thing it does is it populates the state. So these are sort of like our state variables that we've seen in a number of occasions. And the very first call to get state will result in a call to populate state. And that is what we have overridden here in this function here. So in this function, we have set a number of state variables, set the message.id to the value of the ID we've got. And we've also set the params state to whatever we've got from the configuration parameters. And then after it's set populate state, it will set that state set to true. So this really only runs this on the very first occasion. And then after that, this doesn't run at all, the populate state, and it just returns really the property that you're asking for. So what is happening here is that we've got various calls to get state. The very first call to get state will get this run here, and then subsequently we can do the get states here. And in particular, we're getting the state of the params here. Now, one thing just to notice here is this thing clone, because what we're doing here, what we've got here, these registry objects aren't arrays, they're objects. So whenever we assign one to the other or pass them around, really what is happening is that there's a pointer to them being set. And with arrays, if you set A to B, they get copied. But here, it's just the pointer gets passed around. So whenever we've got params here, this is really referring to this thing here, the global params structure there. So if we go and merge something on top of it, we are actually going to change this params here, and then we were then going to change this. So, I mean, you can try it in your code. You can remove this clone and then just do a merge and then try and get the params again, and you'll see they will have changed. So that's why we do this clone, to make sure that we've got a separate copy of the data before we try and merge it, which really corrupts it or which changes it in some way. So that's just something to be aware of. However, it does seem a little bit of a roundabout way. We're actually setting things in populate state and then getting them again here with get state. And one of the things you might like to try then is, can we just get rid of populate state and get these things and put them into here and get it to work? The other thing here is that we've got the variable params really referring to both the params that we've got from the database and the params that we've got from the kind of like global configuration. So it's probably better to change the name there so it's more meaningful. So there's something you might like to try to do, is to change this code a wee bit. So get rid of the populate state, tidy up here, and see if you can make it a bit clearer. Obviously the functionality is going to be the same, but the next thing I'm going to suggest is to change the functionality a little bit. And if we go here, let's go to components, contacts. I've put in a couple of contacts here. And you notice that if you go into edit contacts and you look at some of the tabs here, you'll see that it doesn't have use global, but it has use global, and then it has in brackets the current value that the global parameter is set to. So you might want to change that. In our case, we have just got show category. Can we change it to, sorry, this thing here, we've just got use global. Can we change it so that it either shows show or hide in brackets? And you can have a look at the XML definition of this edit form for the contacts, and you can also have a look at this page list form field type, and that should give you a pretty good clue as to how to go about doing that. And the final thing you might like to try and do is, here you've got information displayed on separate tabs, and can we get our own information displayed on separate tabs like that? And I'll just install this other version of this step in the tutorial, and you see what I mean. But basically, if you go to the layout file for contacts, you'll see information about how it goes about displaying these things. For example, it uses some of the Bootstrap tabs. You can see tabs stuff there, and if you go to the layout file, you can see that for contacts. And then if you try and do the same thing on Hello World and edit something like that, we can set up tabs so that we've got message details here, we've got params details here, and we can set it to whatever it is currently, show or hide. Okay, that's about it for this step. Thanks very much for listening.